In this lecture, we will be looking at Chapter 29, Modernism in Europe and America, 1900 to 1945. Now, this chapter is a very large chapter with a lot of information in it, so try not to get overwhelmed. As I mentioned in class, I would take this chapter in smaller bites. Don't try to read all of it at once. And what I would do, how I would focus on it, is he tries to arrange it how he has the other chapters, where he's positioned himself in a place and during a time period. However, what happens once we get into the 20th century is the art world kind of shatters. And because of this, it's hard to follow along in the linear fashion. What I would do is I would focus more on the individual styles and being clear of, okay, so if we're looking at Fauvism, when was Fauvism? Where did it develop? Things such as that, instead of trying to create just one continuous linear structure as we've had before. All right, so within this chapter, what we're looking at, again, as I just mentioned, up to this point, pretty much all the artistic styles have followed a linear progression, meaning they have either come as a reaction to the art style before or they've developed out of. So, for example, realism developed as a reaction to romanticism, impressionism as a reaction to realism, post-impressionism developed out of impressionism. Well, what happens when we get to the modern world? And when we talk about modernism, we are talking roughly about 1890, 1900 to about 1945, about the end of World War II. And what happens is we've had these massive, massive changes. If you've paid attention, as we get further in time, the time periods we look at get smaller and smaller. And this is because the world kind of starts moving quickly, more and more quickly. And we're going to see all these technological developments. We talked in class, I gave you the modernism timeline, where we talked about how quickly these things happened. Also, the trauma of World War I and the World War II, this darkened disillusionment of the world. And the arts reflect this. It reflects this changing, this rapidly changing world. And what happens is it shatters. We're going to see all of these artists trying to deal with this almost new reality, and they all do it in very different ways. So what we'll look at first is modernism. Modernism, again, late 1800s to through about World War II, 1945. It developed more as a rejection of romanticism and realism, but realistically it was more of a rejection of almost all art forms that came before, meaning all of the traditional conventions and forms. The main cry of modernism is to make it new, meaning forget the rules of the past, forget the rules of the academy, and make art new. And we'll talk in a minute about the avant-garde. And the avant-garde is art that goes against tradition and expectation. Innovation and experimentation are celebrated in modernism, and the world is now seen as in a constant state of flux. And because of this, there is no coherence in the world, and the art world reflects this chaos and this unknown future. Modernism also denies the authority of the past, meaning that the peak of Western civilization was not ancient Greece or Rome or even the Renaissance, but it reflects the belief that, this peak of mankind has actually not happened yet, and the potential of man is unlimited. And again, after World War II, when we have the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's this realization that man now has the power to destroy the world and that man will use it. All right, well, next let's take a moment and talk about the avant-garde. Avant-garde literally means front guard, and it developed from the 19th century French military usage. And what the avant-garde were, they were groups of troops that were sent ahead. And they would go and they would scout, and then they would come back and report to the rest of the troops. And so the term began to be seen as representing visionaries and forward thinking. And so this began to be developed to artists. So these artists that were searching for new definitions and uses of art, they began to be called the avant-garde. Avant-garde has the questioning of nature and the goals of artistic production. And the term avant-garde was often applied to artists who were considered ahead of their time and who had transgressed the limits of established art forms. Basically, they rejected the classic and the academic. They question the premises of informal qualities of traditional Western painting, sculpture, and other media. All right, well, now we're going to start getting into these specific artistic styles. If I were you, I would know the basic tenets of all of these, but I would definitely pick one and know everything about it in case, as I mentioned in class, in case somebody would ask you an essay question on it, that you could fully explain all of the tenets of a specific style, including a specific artist and artwork. And on that note, I would also choose one where there's a lot of information. There's some very small movements where we barely talk about them, or I might even skip here. Those probably aren't going to be the best ones for an answer on an essay question. All right, well then moving on. First, we're going to look at Fauvism. Fauvism developed about 1905, and Fauvism was a term that was actually coined by the art critic Louis Facile when he claimed he was looking at a Fauvis sculpture, and he claimed it looked like a Donatello in a cage of wild beasts. What the Fauvists do is they used violent distortion of color, and they believe that color can be an expressive force, and often the claims that the works were deliberate disharmonies. One critic said of their work, "One feels completely in the realm of abstraction. Of course, as in the most extreme departures of Van Gogh, something still remains of the original feeling of nature, but here one finds, above all in the work of Matisse, the sense of painting in itself, the act of pure painting." And that's what we see here. This is a work by Henri Matisse. He was French, 1869 to 1954, probably the most well-known of the Fauvist painters. And again, within Fauvism, we're still going to see representation of it. We can look at this and know it's a portrait of a woman, yet this brushstroke and the violent distortion of color changes this. Interestingly enough, the Fauvists were actually never an organized group like the Impressionists who we just spoke about. Within this work, this is Matisse's Woman with the Hat. It's also called Madame Matisse. It was actually his wife. 1905, oil on canvas. And what Matisse was trying to do is he tried to paint pictures, as he would say, that would unravel the tensions of modern existence. He saw line and color as indivisible from one another, and he tried to express his feelings as objects of aesthetic interest. And here's a quote from him. He said, "The chief function of color should be to serve expression as well as possible. My choice of colors does not rest on any scientific theory. It is based on observation, on sensitivity, on felt experiences. I simply try to put down colors which render my sensation." And again, you see that in the work here. In the painting of his wife, we see that he plays with the blue-violet, the red, orange, and the green. And then these broad color zones, and he has no attempt to harmonize them within the work. This is another Fauvist work. This is André Derain, 1880 to 1954. This is Mountains at Colère, 1905, and oil on canvas. Colère is actually a town on the southeastern coast of France, and here you see this is a landscape painting. We can tell it is. You can see the trees and the mountains and the hills in the distance, and even a little winding path here. But again, he is liberating color from its traditional role. And what he tried to do, much like Matisse, is he used color to help create a mood. All right, moving on, we're going to move on to Expressionism, or as the textbook calls it, German Expressionism. It did start in Germany, and I already talked last time a little bit when we looked at Van Gogh. This is Van Gogh's Starry Night, that he was kind of more of a transitional artist from post-impressionism into Expressionism. And what Expressionism does is it attempts to elicit in the viewer the same emotions the artist had in creating the work. Often we're going to see the liberation of color and the celebration of sexuality. And we're going to see some of the early works, artists maintain some representational values or aspects, such as in this one by Vincent van Gogh. We see that it's some sort of a landscape. However, what's going to happen as we move on into Der Blue Reiter group, that we're going to see the works become almost completely abstract. Expressionism was an outcry against materialism, urbanization, and industrialization. Many of the works often had apocalyptic scenes of civilization's own destruction. And then again, later works became completely abstract and non-objective. So the first of the German expressionist groups that created was Der Bruch. Der Bruch organized in Dresden in 1905, and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner is the artist that you see here. He was one of the leaders of the Der Bruch. Der Bruch means the bridge, and they named themselves this because they saw themselves as paving the way to a more perfect age by bridging the old with the new. So they saw themselves as a transition from the art of the old to the art of the new. They modeled themselves on a medieval craft guilds whose members all lived together and practiced all arts equally. They protested the hypocrisy and materialistic decadence of those they saw in power, and Kirchner himself focused on the detrimental effects of industrialization. He saw industrialized cities that posted more of a mechanical, impersonal society, and that's what we see in the painting here. This is Street, Dresden, 1908, dated 1907, and it's an oil on canvas. And what we see here is it shows the activity of a city, and it's Dresden, and this was before World War I. Here, it's meant to be both jarring and dissonant in both composition and color. We can see here as we look at the figures, these bright, limey greens and yellows, especially used on the face. It makes it seem, the woman on the right, makes her seem almost otherworldly. And then the perspective is very off. If we look at the street, we understand he's using somewhat of an atmospheric perspective, but it's so steep, it almost seems that the people might tumble onto our laps, the laps of the viewer. And again, it's meant to seem this way. And so what he's making a comment on is he's commenting on this very, very busy street, yet there's really no interaction between the people on the street here. And so that's that kind of loneliness and isolation of the industrialized city. The second group of the German expressionists are Der Blühreiter, Vasily Kandinsky, the artist you're seeing here, 1866 to 1944. He was Russian. He was the leader of Der Blühreiter group, which means the Blue Rider, and this actually was a reference to the story of St. George slaying the dragon. Der Blühreiter organized in Munich in 1911, and what happens is Kandinsky becomes one of the first artists to actually reject representation and begins to explore abstraction as the subject of his paintings. He was also very interested in the new sciences that were developing, such as Planck's theory of quantum physics, Einstein's theory of relativity, which questions, the makeup of the universe and how the universe is made up. And because of this, it deeply affected Kandinsky, and he became convinced that material objects had no real substance. And because of this, it shattered his faith in a world of tangible things. And so that's part of the reason why he became completely abstract in his work. What we're looking at here is Improvisation 28, the second version, painted 1912, and it is an oil on canvas. And here we clearly see the elimination of recognizable forms. And Kandinsky believed through color and line alone, works of art could express the feelings and emotions of the artist directly to the viewer. He believed his works to be equal to music and that they were alive and non-figurative. Each line and each color carried explicit expressive meaning. And he stated in his work concerning the spiritual and art that he wrote in 1911, he said, color is able to obtain what is most universal, yet at the same time most elusive in nature, its inner force. And so what he believed that paintings like his had the power to lead us away from the outer to the inner basis. Color for him had very specific meanings. Blue was the heavenly color, yellow the color of earth, green, which was the mixture of the two. He saw it as both passive and static, yet it can represent the self-satisfied, fat, and healthy. The color red stimulates and excites the heart, and red and green, which are complementary colors, juxtapose the passive and the active, and their harmony is very charming. He claimed they showed the simplicity and the pastoral harmony of an idealized peasant life. Next, we're going to move on to the artist Kat Kollwitz, 1867 to 1945. Now, while she is considered an expressionist artist, she never had any formal association with the other expressionistic groups. Her works we're going to see much more emotional, and usually they expressed pity for the poor and the suffering, especially during World War I. Here we see Woman with Dead Child, 1903, and it's etching and soft ground etching. Here, this is a universal statement of maternal loss and grief, and it's often linked to the very religious work of the Pietà, which shows the Virgin Mary holding the body of the dead Christ. Here, we just see a mother literally holding on to the body of her dead child, and it creates a very powerful emotional image. It was also kind of a premonition. She used her own younger son, Peter, as the model for the dead child in this work. And sadly, Peter actually died fighting in World War I at the age of 21. Eventually, the expressionistic movement died out because many outsiders began to see the works as inapproachable, especially as they became more abstract. In Germany, the Nazis deemed it as degenerate art and because so, outlawed it. Other very famous examples of expressionistic works are Edvard Munch's The Scream. All right, now we're going to move on to probably one of the most well-known of the modernist movements, and this is Cubism. Cubism, you're going to see in the left-hand corner, this is a work we looked at last time. This is Cezanne, who was the post-impressionist, who was sometimes considered the founder or first Cubist artist. And again, this is the work Mont Sainte-Victoire seen from Lever's 1902 to 04. And here, remember, he broke down the work into what he saw as the basic geometric forms. Well, Cubists take this idea and they take it even further. Cubism was formally recognized around 1908, and what happens is Cezanne's work strongly influenced Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, and they are the two founders of Cubism. Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973, is probably the most well-known of the Cubist artists, and he's often considered the most influential artist of the 20th century. And what happens in Cubism is Cubism changes the way space is dealt with in a work. The term was actually coined again in a review of Braque's work that stated, Braque reduces everything, places and figures and houses, to geometric schemes, little cubes. And what the Cubists were doing is they tried to paint not just objects, but also the space they engender. Cubists represent a three-dimensional world in two-dimensional terms. The objects themselves become part of the space around it. If the object is removed, the painting fails. Often we're going to see simplified color and restricted form because we are again focusing on the shape in the space. The space. They often played with reality of painting and the reality of the known world. Cubism freed painting of the necessity to represent the world as it was. Now, your text does break it into two different types. Analytical Cubism, which is the first stage, where artists mainly are concerned with analyzing the structure of form, and then synthetic Cubism, which develops about 1912, and this is where artists begin constructing paintings and drawings from objects and shapes cut from paper and other materials. For our purposes, this may show up on a quiz, but generally Cubism is looked at as one continual movement. All right, here we're going to see the work of Pablo Picasso, and this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, oil on canvas, and this is actually a very large work. It's 8 feet by 7 feet 8 inches. And in 1923, Picasso actually stated about art and about Cubism, he stated, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize truth, at least the truth that is given us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of his lies. They speak of naturalism in opposition to modern painting. I would like to know if anyone has ever seen a natural work of art. Nature and art, being two different things, cannot be the same thing. Through art, we express our conception of what nature is not. And we see this here in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Here we're going to see these subdued colors, simplified forms, and there is no one clear viewpoint. Interestingly enough, the title was actually not chosen by Picasso, but by a friend, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek. Les Demoiselles means the lady, and Avignon is usually known as the city in France where once the popes lived. But in fact, what we see here, these are not ladies, they're actually prostitutes, and Avignon that is referred to is a street in Barcelona which holds the brothels, not the city of popes in southern France. The painting itself was modified many times. We know this because it's been x-rayed. Early sketches show there were originally two men in the work, a sailor seated in the middle, and a medical student entering from the left, drawing back the curtain. Now one of the prostitutes draws back the curtain, bringing the viewer into the work. The x-ray shows the painting itself went under many revisions. The figure on the left and the two on the right have many layers of paint to them. Speculation is that Picasso changed the faces of these three because he visited an art show in Paris and he saw an exhibition of African masks and he was strongly affected and influenced by them. He claimed the masks seemed imbued with power that allowed him, for the first time, to see art as a form of magic designed to be a mediator between the strange, hostile world and us, a way of seizing power by giving form to our terrors as well as our desires. He then changed the three faces to further reflect his desire to show the ambiguity of experience. And so here, you can note the double viewpoint. So even if we look at the two center women who seem to face the viewer, their eyes are looking directly back at us, right? So that's one vantage point. But if you look at their noses are actually in profile. And so we cannot simultaneously see this view in real life. Also, if you look at the forms of the women, such as the woman on the left, if you look at her leg, it actually starts to break down. As it's broken down into these shapes, these geometric forms, it also encapsulates the space around them. So if we try to remove the objects, meaning the women from the work, from the space, we really cannot do that. All right, both of these work are by Georges Braque, 1882 to 1963. He also was influenced by both Picasso and Cezanne, and again we're going to see in his works this flattening and simplification of forms. The work on the left is the Portuguese 1911 oil on canvas, and what we're seeing here is we're seeing a guitarist playing at a cafe. Yet what he has done is he's taken this image and he's again broken it up and almost mixed it up into these very geometric shapes and cubes. If you look in the foreground, kind of the bottom center, you can see the guitar sound hole and the strings. The fragment lettering also plays with the idea of dimensionality because we are seeing this musician being shown who should be three-dimensional, yet we know lettering to be two-dimensional and flat. Also, the subdued hues are very done in order to, again, to have focus on the form. And he plays with the viewer's perception of two-dimensional and three-dimensional space. And with this, it's almost impossible to arrive at any definitive or final reading of the composition because of this fragmentation. He purposefully disrupts expectations about the representation of space and time. Now, the work on the right is Bottle, Newspaper, Pipe, and Glass from 1913, and this is that second stage of Cubism. Here is what we have is called collage. Collage is actually from the French word coller, which means stuck paper. And in collage, artists typically glue assorted paper shapes to a drawing or a painting. Here, Braque also uses charcoal lines and shadow to play with multiple viewpoints. Interesting, the pipe in the foreground appears to lie on top of a newspaper, but it's actually a form that's cut from the paper itself. So what we think is an actual shape, in reality, is an absence. Picasso explains the goals of the Cubist collage. He says, not only did we try to displace reality, reality was no longer the object. In the paper collé, we didn't any longer want to fool the eye, we wanted to fool the mind. If a piece of newspaper can be a bottle, that gives us something to think about in connection with both newspapers and bottles too. All right, and then the final work we're going to look at with Cubism, this is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, 1937, oil on canvas. This is a very large work. It's 11 feet 5.5 inches by 25 feet 3/4 inches. And what happens here is later in life, Picasso became open to some art being able to represent some political issues. He said, painting is not made to decorate apartments. It's an instrument for offensive and defensive war against the enemy. And this work is actually based off of an air raid that was carried out by German pilots in the Spanish Civil War on April 26 of 1937, where the city of Guernica was bombed. And of the 7,000 people that lived there, they were mostly civilians. And so what this work represents is it represents a universal outcry of human grief. And it gave visual form to the horror of the aerial bombardment of the citizens. So you can see the light in the upper left-hand portion. That's meant to represent the bomb. You can see the bull on the left. That is a traditional symbol of Spain. We can see either a soldier lying fallen on the ground with a broken sword, or perhaps that's the artwork of the past. On the left, there is a mother holding a dead child. On the right, we see people fleeing a burning building. Some are on fire. And so what he's doing with this work, again, is he's trying to show, the horrors of war on the innocent. And so this is definitely a very political piece, and this is still located in Spain. Next, we're going to look at two movements that are not a lot of information on them. The first here we see of Orphism. This is what was considered a type of color cubism. Here you see the work by Robert Delaney, 1885 to 1941. This is his homage to Bayreuth, 1914, oil on canvas. And what happens in this color cubism is whereas traditional cubism, again, is the subdued colors, here what we see is the artists are exploiting the expressive capabilities of color. He called it simulation, but it is now known as Orphism. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to create the special effects and kaleidoscopic movements solely through color contrast. And he also was celebrating technological innovation. And again, we see this in the homage to Bayreuth, who was a well-known aviator. He flew across the English Channel. So what we see in here, while we see some of the abstract, the shapes, and the cubes, we also see some very recognizable forms, such as the plane, the Eiffel Tower, and the propeller. Bayreuth was also manufacturing warplanes for the use of the French and their allies in World War II. Again, in the work, mostly semi-abstract shapes and bold colors together convey this explosive energy. Next, we have what's called Purism. Purism maintained that the machinery's clean functional lines and the pure forms of its parts should directly affect artists' experimentation and design, whether in painting, architecture, or industrial produced objects. Here we see Fernand Laguerre's The City, 1919. It's an oil on canvas. And here again, he's a champion of what's called the machine aesthetic. And this brought together the meticulous cubist analysis of form with Purism's broad simplification and machine-like finish of design components. And as you look at this work closely, what it does is it's showing the effects of modern posters and billboard advertisements, the harsh flashing of electric lights, and the noise of traffic within urban city life. So this is actually an urban scape. And what happens here is it depicts the mechanical commotion of urban life, including the robotic movements of mechanized people. If you look in the center foreground, you see these forms of humans and they almost seem machine-like. Now, these ideas are going to carry over into Futurism. Futurism, the term actually came from Filippo Marinetti's. He was an Italian poet. His manifesto, La Figaro, which was published in a French newspaper, and it called for a new art called Futurism. And again, when we talk about a manifesto, we are talking about kind of, think of it as like an instruction manual for life, how life should be lived. And what happens with Futurism is Futurism would champion aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racer stride, the punch, and the slap. Marinetti claimed he had discovered a new beauty, the beauty of speed. He stated a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath is more beautiful than the victory of Samarth, which is pictured here in the lower right. Futurists claimed that they wanted to destroy the museums, the libraries, and academies, and they wanted to sing of the multicolored, polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. They, in fact, welcomed war as a way of washing away the past. Marinetti said, "What was true for the painters of yesterday is but a falsehood today. We declare that all forms of imitation must be despised, all forms of originality glorified, that all subjects previously used must be swept aside in order to express our whirling life of steel, of pride, of fever, and of speed. The movement and light destroy the materiality of bodies." Futurists also looked for new materials and searched for new forms. And again, it wasn't just limited to art, but it was entire ideology that strove to destroy the past and institute a new society, new art, and new poetry. Modern technical advancements made the works of the past drab and unnecessary. And with all the changes in the new modern world, it was the belief that no past tradition was worth imitating or even maintaining. And they wanted to create this new aesthetic of the loud, industrialized city. And so their works reflect some of these ideas, and some of them called Cubist with movement. And you're going to see that in some of the works here. The work on the left is Giacomo Balla, 1871 to 1958. This is Dadaism of a Dog on a Leash, 1912, in oil on canvas. And here you can see, right, that it is focused on movement. This is just a woman walking her dog, but we can see the movement of the legs, the ears, even the tail of the dog. You can see the leash moving back and forth, and then the woman's stride and step. That is what is focused on here. And then the other work is Umberto Bocchini's 1882 to 1960. This is Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, 1913. However, it actually wasn't cast until 1931 after his death, and this is made of bronze. Here what he does is he takes the human form and he makes it into a futuristic machine. Others have claimed it is merely a nude. Within this work, though, we see this movement. You can see this almost striding forward, and that the figure of the human, the form, becomes machine-like within it. Interestingly enough, the movement the movement died out with World War I because many of them, following the belief in supporting the war, many of them enlisted in the army and died. In fact, Bocchini enlisted in the Italian army and died fighting in World War I. Right, next we're going to look at more of a transitional piece. This is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, 1912, oil on canvas. And here we clearly see the influence of Futurism. The nude figure of the human form, as it's descending the staircase, becomes almost machine-like, and again we see the movement of the form itself. This work is also considered proto-Dadaist, and that Dada is actually the next artwork we're going to look at. And so what happens with this is it's almost transitioning from Futurism into Dadaism. But what happens during this time period, is very important, is World War I, which is called the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Here you had the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire versus the Allies. Now, for the First World War, it was called the Great War because the idea was not just this was the first global conflict we had seen on this scale, but it was called the War because of its size. That this idea was that this war was so massive and so destructive that mankind would never allow this to happen again. And in fact, in this war, over the 4 years, over 9 million soldiers were killed in action. The war was fought in what's called trench warfare, where literally the armies would build in trenches, which are just basically very big ditches, and they would fire constantly at one another. The war also used chemical warfare, which led to many soldiers dying horrific, painful deaths. In fact, chemical warfare is so horrific that we still have global laws against its use in warfare. In fact, with the events in Syria, that's why other countries are getting involved because chemical warfare has been banned. Because of World War I, this sense of disillusionment became. And what many people believed is that the war actually gave frightening meaning to the radical changes of the early 20th century. It became a time of disorder and sorrow. And the English poet William Butler Yeats probably said it best when he said, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold," meaning humanity in existence itself was questioning. And we see a lot of this despair in the different artworks, and especially in the next style that we're going to look at, which is Dada or Dadaism. Now, the term Dada, it is French for hobby horse, but the reason the Dadaists chose this name is basically it's just because it sounds nonsensical. It has no meaning. Your textbook has the story where they, basically just shoved a knife down in a French dictionary and it stabbed on the name Dada, and that's why they chose the movement or the name for the movement. But what happens with Dadaism is after World War I, it emerged as an illustration of the disillusionment many people felt. It developed in both Zurich and New York, and it did take up Futurism's call for annihilation of tradition in the past, but without Futurism's hope for the future. In fact, it was more of a nihilistic approach, basically meaning that there is no meaning in life. Everything is just nonsense. There is no reality. Dada's again used the term nonsense without any meaning, but a lot of the works themselves were about political protests. Dadaists thought the route to salvation was through political anarchy, the irrational, and the intuitive. They focused on irrationality, meaningless, and harsh mechanical image. They championed the senselessness, noise, and illogic. And then Dada again was against art or art in any traditional form. And what happens is also the Dadaists lead to the idea that art must shock, and its original goal is to insult and outrage. In fact, Andre Breton said, "Like everything in life, Dada is useless. Everything happens in a completely idiotic way. We are incapable of treating seriously any subject whatsoever, let alone the subject of ourselves." Hans Arp, a Dadaist artist, 1886 to 1966, he defined Dada as saying it was repelled by the slaughterhouses of the World War, we turned to art. We searched for an elementary art that would, we thought, save mankind from the furious madness of these times. He was famous for creating relief sculptures, or what he would do is he would drop liquid into a series of small puddles onto a surface such as wood. Then he would outline the puddles and then cut out the wooden replicas and then finally put these together. Now, many of the Dadaist works did have an undercurrent of irreverent humor and whimsy, and we're going to see that in two of the works that we see here, both by Marcel Duchamp. The first is Fountain from 1917. In here, what Duchamp is doing, this is what called one of his ready-mades, where he takes materials that are already made and then he uses them in a new manner to create something different. Well, what happens with Fountain is he takes a urinal, he writes Armut 1917 on it, and then he submits it to be in an artistic exhibit under Armut. Well, the powers that be saw it and were like, no, this is not art, and they rejected it. Well, what happens is Duchamp is already a very well-known artist, and here on the left picture, you can see him sitting with Fountain. And what happens is the people who are running the show find out that the artwork is actually by Duchamp. And so what they do is, of course, then they want the artwork in the show. And basically, this proves Duchamp's point. Duchamp wanted to challenge the world to consider all manner of things art. And he says it's really not the object itself that's important, but it's the process and the ideas that the artist goes through. And this rejection and then acceptance of Fountain helps show that idea. The object itself never changed. It was always the same urinal with the same writing on it. What changed was knowing who created it and how it was viewed by the audience. You can see this again, this playfulness, in the other work, the work on the right. This is LHOOQ, 1919. And what this is this is a postcard of Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. He takes it and he puts a mustache and a goatee on it, and then he added with pencil and he named it down at the bottom. And so what happens with this, again, some people claim, oh, he's making a comment about Da Vinci's supposed homosexuality. But again, he's just playing around with this idea of what makes something art. And when you say LHOOQ together phonetically in French, it actually translates to she's got a nice ass. So again, he's playing around with some of these ideas of what is art, but there's this note of whimsy to it. Another Dadaist artist, this is Hannah Hawk, 1889 to 1978. She was German. And what we see here is what's called photo montage. These are works that consisted almost entirely of found details, meaning they're pieces that are found somewhere else. So for here, pieces of newspapers, magazines, photographs, and they're usually combined into deliberately anti-logical compositions. And that's what we see here with Cut with the Kitchen Knife Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany, 1919 to 1920. And so here in this seemingly chaotic work, you actually are showing, or she's showing different political ideas. She's showing the redefinition of women's social roles and the explosive growth of mass print media. And so in the work, it seems nonsensical, but there's actually a deeper meaning to it. All right, the next style that we're going to look at is Suprematism. And what happens here is that this, after World War I, not all art styles developed were negative. Some promoted utopian ideas, and we see that in the Suprematism. Here it was the belief in art's ability to contribute to improving society and all of humankind. Suprematism was created by the Russian artist Kazimir Malkovich, 1878 to 1935. And what he wanted to do and what he did was he developed an abstract style to convey his belief that the supreme reality in the world is one of feeling. And this idea attaches to no object. He called for new, non-objective forms in arts, meaning shapes not related to objects in the visible world. And for him, this became the rectangle and the square. And he called this Suprematism. And he stated, under Suprematism, I understand the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. To the Suprematists, the visual phenomenon of the objective world are, in themselves, meaningless. The significant thing is a feeling, as such, quite apart from the environment in which it is called forth. And here you see his Suprematist composition of Airplane Flying, 1915, oil on canvas. And he strongly believed that people easily understood his new art because of the universality of its symbols of lines and squares. All right, moving on very briefly to some architecture, and this time we have many different styles developing, many different ideas. Again, this idea of making it new. Here is one example. This is Adolf Loos, 1870 to 1933. This is one of his works. This is Villa Murer in Prague, which is in the Czech Republic. It was created 1928 to 1930. And so Loos was the most influential German architect theorist in the 20th century. He was strongly influenced by Louis Sullivan when Sullivan claimed that architects should actually banish all ornamentation from their buildings for a period of years in order that the architect's thought might concentrate acutely upon the production of buildings that were well formed, comely, and in the nude, meaning they needed to focus on the structure and the form itself. And so what happens here is Loss is actually rallying against the excessiveness of Art Nouveau that we looked at last time. He saw ornamentation in architecture. He said it was a crime, both on aesthetic grounds and because it wasted both materials and manual labor. And we see that again in the image here. This is Villa Prague. It was built for Franz Müller, who co-owned a construction company that specialized in providing reinforced concrete for industrial products. So here what we have is the building itself is actually a celebration of this reinforced concrete. The building is very cubical in form, and it has a reinforced concrete skeleton and there's a severe white stucco shell. And as you look at it, there is no ornamentation of any kind. The only ornamentation you could even see would be considered the doors and the windows. All right, well now we're going to shift our focus a little bit to the United States from 1900 to 1930. At this point in time, art in the United States was not quite as revolutionary as it was in Europe. And we have to remember, even though the United States eventually gets involved in World War I, World War I took place completely in Europe, so we had no fighting on American soil. Because of this, we didn't see quite as much disillusionment as we saw in Europe. However, that will soon change. For the first 10 years or so of the new century, many artists still focused on realism, and we see that here. And what we see in this work is there developed a group of artists who were known as John Sloan and the Eight, and they also began to be known as the Ash Can School. Because what they wanted to do was they wanted to make pictures from real life, and they often would show the rapidly changing landscape of New York City, including the bleak and seedy aspects of life. And some critics actually refer to them as the apostles of ugliness. So the ash can school, right, it's supposed to represent that dirty ashes left at the bottom of basically an ashtray. And we see this in one of the works here. This is John Sloan. His date's 1871 to 1951. He was one of the members of the Eight. And in his works, he focused on the working class, which he perceived as embodying the realities of life. This painting is 6th Avenue and 30th Street in New York City, 1907, and it is also an oil on canvas. And what we see here is it captures both the visual and the social realities of American urban life. To the left, you see the elevated train tracks. In the back and to the right, we see storefronts and apartment buildings of a less than prosperous area in New York City. And so we also see a cross-section of the city's population. Probably the main focal point is the woman in white. However, if you look at her, she's very shabbily dressed, and she is actually a drunk. You can see she's carrying her pail of beer with her. Directly to the right of her are two women in very nice clothing who are definitely just passing through this neighborhood, and they look at her with this sense of disdain. And so what he's showing here is he's showing the street life of New York's underclass, and he's showing his deep sympathy for them. All right, moving on, no longer part of the Ashcan School. Here we have Marsden Hartley, 1877 to 1943. He was American, but he was very strongly influenced by Cubism. In 1913, he moved to Berlin, and there he surrounded himself in military imagery. And here we see Portrait of a German Officer, 1914, oil on canvas. And all of these have military-related images: German imperial flags, regimental insignia, badges, emblems such as the Iron Cross. Yet the work actually had a personal meaning to him. So what we're seeing with this is Portrait of a German Officer. So it's supposed to represent a specific person, but it's more of the objects and the shapes that define the person and not the form itself. For him, this work had very personal meaning, and it referenced his lover, Lieutenant Karl von Freyberg, who had actually died in battle a few months before this work was made. You can see in the lower left, you can see the initials KF or KVF. His age, 24, that was in the lower right, that was his age when he died. His regiment number, 4, is in the center, along with the letter E, which stood for his regiment, which was the Bavarian Eichsplan, and this very somber black background. Again, we see the Cubist influence, that basically things are broken down to their geometric shape, and the work is very flat and patterned. All right, another artistic style that developed was called Precisionism. This, again, was not an organized group, but it was some artists that shared some common ideas, and so they're often put into what's called Precisionism. Within Precisionism, there's this fascination with the machine's precision. And we're going to see in the works this focus on flat, sharply delineated planes. And we see that in the work here of Georgia O'Keeffe, 1887 to 1986. She was born in Wisconsin, and during the 20s, she was a precisionist. And during this time, she was very, very fascinated with the fast pace of city life. And we see this in New York Night, 1929, oil on canvas. Here we see a cityscape dominated by the large buildings, but the buildings are reduced to these very simple planes with these very simple windows that are lit up. O'Keeffe actually becomes better known for her later work that is much more abstract, and this is where she would focus on a single object such as a flower, and she would look at them so closely that they almost seem to become something else. But this is an example of her precisionist work. Now, she was married to the next artist we're going to see here, which is Alfred Stieglitz. And here we're having photography becoming more and more influential in the art world, and it's starting to be respected as a branch of the fine arts in the United States. Some people were still just viewing photography as more of a scientific or mechanical process, that you go up and you push a button, and then that is what actually creates the art, not the artist. Alfred Stieglitz, 1864 to 1946, worked very hard to get photography accepted as a fine art form, and he developed what we call straight photography, and this is where he wanted unmanipulated photographs. He said photographs are to hold a moment, to record something so completely that those who see it would relive an equivalent of what has been expressed. And so for him, it wasn't how things could be manipulated or staged, but it was how the artist composed the shot. And we see this in the Steerage 1907. And so within this work, where he's showing different passengers on a ship, it's clearly making a political statement that in the upper level, we see the upper classes, and down below, we see the lower classes. How the composition is, with the gangplank across, clearly cutting it, and then we even have the triangles of the stairs to the right and the smokestack to the left, which go up and on the top meet a mast. This triangle composition seems to put everybody in the same space, yet they are very clearly separated from each other. All right, briefly, another architectural style, well, not just architects, but another style that emerged in the United States was Art Deco. This was a movement in the 1920s and the 1930s. And here, this was work, they focused on the new materials, and they used these materials into decorative patterns for the home and for the office. Art Deco focuses on the streamlined, elongated, symmetrical aspects of these works. So we're going to see in the design these simple flat shapes that alternate with shallow volumes and hard patterns. Probably the best example of Art Deco in architecture is what we see here. This is William Van Allen, 1882 to 1954. This is the Chrysler Building in New York City, that constructed 1928 to 1930. And the spire is showing this Art Deco. We see the different fan shapes and then the shine in the glittering sun. And that represents that Art Deco style. All right, moving quickly to Europe, 1920 to 1945. We have another artistic movement called Neuaufschlag, which is German for the new objectivity. At some point, the artists in this group all served in the German army. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to present a very clear-eyed, direct, and honest images of the world, especially showing the Great War and its effects. This movement includes George Grosz, Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, and Ernst Bloch. Here we're going to look at the work by Otto Dix. Otto Dix, 1891 to 1969. Initially, he tried to find redeeming value in the war, and he claimed it helped him experience the depths of life. However, as war continued, he saw the utter devastation of war both on the land and on humans. And we see this showing of this devastation in his artwork, such as here, this is Der Krieg, which means the war, 1929-1932. And here, it's a panoramic view of devastation. We see mangled bodies that are riddled with bullet holes. On the left, we see the soldiers marching. The middle is the war. And on the right, in the right panel, he actually put himself in it. He is the soldier trying to drag away another soldier. And then the bottom panel, this is reflective of those memento mori we saw in earlier works. And here we see soldiers that are perhaps sleeping in a bunker or they're already dead. And he very intentionally made this artwork look like an altarpiece. And what he was trying to do is he said he felt compelled to lay bare the realities of his time. All right, next we're moving into probably another one of the most popular artistic styles during this time period, and that's Surrealism. Surrealism also developed in a reaction to World War I, but it was more hopeful than the Dadaist movement. Andre Breton, 1896 to 1966, wrote the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, and here he claimed the Surrealists sought to reunite the conscious and the unconscious realms of experience so fully that the world of dream and fantasy would join the everyday rational world in an absolute reality, which is surreality. So these artists were very interested in the works of Sigmund Freud and the subconscious. And the Surrealists thought their works were created by what's called pure psychic automatism, meaning that you just start to create the work, and then at some point just the unconscious or the subconscious mind takes over. The goal here was to merge both reason and unreason, and they wanted to discover the basic realities of psychic life by the automatic associations. So a painter has a dream, then the painter can then transfer that image to the canvas without control or consciousness. Now, Surrealism tended to manifest in two ways. The first was where we contain recognizable forms, if not fantastic subject matter. And your textbook labels this as naturalistic surrealism. And then we're going to see the other form, which is called biomorphic surrealism, where works that are almost fully abstract present a world of indecipherable visual riddles. But we're going to start with the naturalistic surrealism, where we can see recognizable forms. So the work on the left is Salvador Dali, 1904 to 1989. He was a Spanish-born painter, and here we see the persistence of memory from 1931. This is an oil on canvas. And Dali claimed that his works were, as he says, hand-painted dream photographs. And so these were images that he dreamed, and then he had to put them on canvas. And he says he himself, again, doesn't really know what they mean. So as we see the melting clocks or the ants on the clock, we want to make these assumptions. He's talking about how memory fades or dies, but again, for himself, he says he doesn't really know. This is just a dream he had. Now, he did say it was somewhat of a self-portrait because the large slug-like figure in the front, he says that's actually him. Now, another work here, this is by Giorgio de Chirico, 1888 to 1978. He was an Italian artist. And de Chirico is in the text, but I actually chose a different artwork than the one here. This is Melancholy and Mystery of a Street, 1914, and it is also an oil on canvas. Now, de Chirico claimed he did not understand his own paintings. He said they were simply images that obsessed him, and they conveyed anxiety. And so, again, he just had to put them down on canvas. His works actually often have this sinister air to them that recalled Nietzsche's claim of foreboding that underneath this reality in which we live and have our being, another altogether different reality lies concealed. And so for these images that he just can't get out of his mind, right, there seems to be this underlying darkness to them. All right, another surrealist artist is René Magritte, 1998 to 1967. He was a Belgian artist, and he became very well known for a number of very witty and thought-provoking images. Often he would depict ordinary objects in some sort of an unusual context, and what he was doing is he's challenging the observer's preconceived perceptions of reality. And we see that in the work here. This is The Treachery of Images, 1928 to 1929, and it is an oil on canvas. And so here we see painted what looks like a pipe. However, underneath it reads in French, "This is not a pipe." So what he's doing is he's challenging the assumptions of underlying the reading of visual art. We look at this and we're like, oh, it's a pipe, we understand it. Yet the artist himself says, no, this is not a pipe. So what he's doing is he's trying to wreak havoc on the viewer's reliance on the conscious and the rational. We can only understand this is not a pipe when we let those already formed ideas go away. All right, here, this is the work of Marie Oppenheim. She was born in Berlin in 1913, died 1985, and she is a female surrealist artist. And here what we see in her sculpture is she would often combine ordinary objects in very extraordinary ways. This originally was entitled Object, but becomes known as Luncheon in Fur, 1936. It is a fur-covered cup, saucer, and spoon. And the story of this kind of coming around is that she made the comment that her tea was cold, and somebody was like, oh, well, then why don't you put it in furs to keep it warm? Well, of course, that seems, kind of unrealistic. Do you want to drink tea out of this? But that's what she's playing around with, this, these ideas. Well, to keep things warm, you wrap it in fur, but are you really going to do this with tea? And so, again, she's making this disturbing thought from drinking tea from a fur-lined cup. All right, next is the biomorphic surrealism. And again, these are works that are almost fully abstract, and they present a world of indecipherable visual riddles. Here we see Joan Miro's work, 1893 to 1983. And what he's doing, this one's simply just titled Painting, 1933 in oil on canvas. And he practiced what's called that automation, where he claimed that by 1925, he was drawing almost entirely from his own hallucinations. So he would just create and he would paint, and he had no idea what these works were. It was just what he felt he had to get down onto the canvas themselves. Now, the Surrealists are a very interesting group of artists. They would experiment with very many different forms, and they would experiment in different substances, drugs, drinking, to try to bring that unconsciousness up into the conscious world. All right, the next work we're going to look at, the next style is called de Stijl. It means the style in Dutch. This was founded in 1917 in Holland. And again, this offered more of an affirmative, hopeful response to World War I. What the de Stijl does is it champions pure abstraction. However, it tries to find this balance between the universe and the individual. Here we see Piet Mondrian's 1872 to 1944. He was a Dutch artist. And he considers what he does is he takes Cubism to its logical conclusion. And he literally turns the work into cubes. He believed that works must be presented on a flat plane, and any attempts at perspective was falsifying the work. And he calls this pure plastic art, and he believed this actually expressed universal reality. He used the basic shapes and lines of the square and the rectangle, and then the pure vertical and horizontal lines. There are no diagonals. He used the primary colors of red, blue, and yellow, and then the pure colors of black, white, and sometimes gray. And what he claims, he says, to approach the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality, because reality is opposed to the spiritual. Art should be above reality. Otherwise, it would have no value for man. The next artistic style we're going to look at is abstraction. Now, your textbook does not label this as abstraction, but that usually is what this form is known as. Abstraction usually takes two forms. Number one, it's the reduction of images from form to shapes that represent actual objects, which is what we see here. Or two, the pure use of color, line, shadow, mass, and other formal elements to make an object refer only to itself. Now, that's what I was referring back to when I talked about Georgia O'Keeffe and her flower paintings. Abstraction seeks to explore the expressive qualities of formal design elements and materials for their own right. And basically, the idea is abstracting the essence of an object. And sculpture sought to do this and be three-dimensional. And we see that in the work here of Constantine Brancusi, 1876 to 1957. And this is what's considered primitive sculpture. And in his works, we see these very simple geometric forms. This is Bird in Space, 1920, bronze. Now, it's not supposed to be a bird itself, but instead it's supposed to evoke the bird in flight. And Brancusi said, "Don't look for obscure formulas or mystery. It is pure joy I am giving you." Now, this work is actually very interesting because it was the subject of a court case. What happened was this Brancusi's work, Bird in Space, was being shipped to the United States for an art show. And artworks they're not subject to a duty when they travel. Well, what happens is the people in the offices basically said, well, no, in the customs office said, this isn't an artwork. It's not a bird. It doesn't look like a bird. And they didn't understand the idea of the abstraction. And in fact, they actually labeled this as, I believe, a kitchen utensil. And because of this, had to pay a tariff. And what happened is actually a court case developed about this. And so it was kind of challenging in showing this idea of, are these abstract works actually art? And in the end, the court did rule that this was a type of art, and therefore it was not subject to the tariff. All right, moving on, looking at some of the architecture at the time, we're going to spend some time talking about the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was formed with Walter Gropius, 1883-1969. He was German. And what happens with the Bauhaus goal, it was a school. And its goal was to interrelate art, science, and technology, so there was no dividing line between the fine arts, architecture, and industrial-produced functional objects. In fact, the Bauhaus Manifesto reads, "The Bauhaus strives to coordinate all creative effort to achieve, in a new architecture, the unification of all training in all art and design. The ultimate, if distant, goal of the Bauhaus is the collective work of art, the building, in which no barriers exist between the structural and the decorative arts." And so what they strove to do is that the artists wouldn't just be able to create the building, they could create all aspects, everything that would go in the building. In 1920s, the Bauhaus School was in Weimar, Germany, and again it was founded by Walter Gropius, who was an architect. And he believed in architecture. He approached aesthetics from more of an engineering point of view. Therefore, any unneeded decorative elements were removed. And again, the Bauhaus ideology was to combine the arts and crafts. The Bauhaus students were trained in both theory and practice of the arts, and they also wanted to make artists and designers more socially responsible. What we're going to see in the schools, in each class, you had a technical instructor, but then you also had an artist, and they were both the teachers. And what happens is, again, they could design every aspect of the building. And here, the best example of this, your textbook talks about the actual school building, but here, this is the House on Horn, named for the street it was on. So literally, it's the House on Horn. This was a house that was created. It was a prototype of cheap, mass-produced construction using the latest materials. It was a steel frame with concrete infill. You see from the floor plan on the lower right, there was a central large room, and then that was surrounded by rooms for every need. Bedrooms, bathrooms, children's rooms, and within those rooms, everything that was needed for the function of that room was in it. The equipment of the house was basic, but it was innovated, and all were created entirely by the Bauhaus workshops. Each room has its own definite character, but it suits its purpose. It's both functional and makes living easier. The aim of the house was to achieve the greatest comfort with the greatest economy by the application of the best craftsmanship and the best distribution of space and form. Now, what ends up happening is the Bauhaus has to move from Weimar to Dessau due to political pressure, and eventually the Bauhaus actually had to close its doors altogether because it was condemned by the Nazi Party and was seen as un-German, and therefore deviant and Jewish. The artists scattered, and many of them actually traveled to the United States. Moholy Nagy moved to Chicago and actually reopened a new Bauhaus in 1944, which became the Chicago Institute of Design, and then part of the Illinois Institute of Technology. All right, another architect, Le Corbusier, 1886 to 1965. He called the house the machine for living, and it said houses and homes should be designed in a way that is comfortable yet functional. And here we're going to see an example of this. This is Savoy House in France, 1929 to 1930. And what happened? During his career, Le Corbusier developed a set of architectural principles that dictated his technique, which he called the 5 points of new architecture. And these are most evident in the Villa Savoy. The 5 points are pilouettes. This was replacement of supporting walls by a grid of reinforced concrete columns that bear the structural load. He says this is the basics of the new aesthetic. And you can see this on the first floor where we see these concrete pillars. So most of the first floor is actually open, yet still covered so it can be used. The second point is the free designing of the ground plan. Again, the absence of supporting walls means the house is unrestrained in its internal use. The free design of the facade or the face that separates the exterior of the building from its structural function. He sets the facade free from these structural constraints. The fourth point is the horizontal window, which cuts the facade along its entire length, and it lights all rooms equally. And then finally, the roof garden on a flat roof. He says this can serve a domestic purpose while also providing essential protection to the concrete roof. And so we see here within this, there were different ramps, spiral staircases, and so he wanted to have the most functional space that was designed for actual living. All right, this concludes chapter 29. However, I want to put a little note in here. You might have noticed in the slides and in the lecture, there was a little section in the middle where it talked about the United States and the Ashcan School, Marsden Hartley, Georgia O'Keeffe, Art Deco. That is not in your chapter 29. This is actually, the book we have is a new edition, and this was one of the changes. They actually took the old chapter 29, which was Modernism in Europe, the United States, and Mexico all in one chapter, and they broke it into 2 separate chapters. So next week when you read chapter 30, that's going to be Modernism in the United States and Mexico, 1900 to 1945. I left the little blip about the United States in the middle of this lecture because honestly, this was a very long lecture and I did not want to re-record the entire thing. So that's why you're going to see that in the middle. If you're like, wait, this isn't here, that's why. And we will go over that material again in chapter 30, which is, it will be discussed in the newer edition. And then so next week you'll have chapter 30, Modernism in the United States and Mexico, 1900 to 1945. I just wanted to address that really quick if you were wondering why that information was there.